You trust a mortician to care for your loved ones after death. But in the 1980s, one man turned that trust into terror. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of David Sconce, the mortician who mutilated bodies, melted hundreds at once, and pocketed gold from the mouths of the dead. You may want to leave the lights on. Pasadena, California, spring 1984. On the outside, Lamb Funeral Home was everything a grieving family could hope for. A pristine white building with a gabled roof and rose bushes lining the walkway. The grass was always clipped, the drapes always drawn, and the brass signage by the front door gleamed like a promise. Dignity, care, compassion. Mourners entered through the carved oak doors in silence, clutching tissues and memories. Inside, soft organ music drifted through the air. Staff wore pressed suits and gentle smiles. The air was perfumed with lilies and lemon polish. Everything told the families they had chosen well. But behind that immaculate image, deeper in the building, beyond the casket showroom, past the velvet-lined chapel, and through the steel door labeled "Private," the atmosphere changed. The temperature rose, the scent soured, the light dimmed. In the cremation chamber, David Sconce worked like a man possessed. He wore thick rubber gloves and a butcher's apron splattered with what he called residue. Bodies arrived daily, more than he should have been able to legally handle. But Sconce had a system. He stacked them, 3, sometimes 4 at a time, cracking limbs if they didn't fold easily. He called it batch processing. To him, the dead weren't sacred. They were inventory. He'd stand by the roaring furnace with a clipboard and stopwatch, eyes reflecting the glow of charring flesh and bone, and whisper to himself, "Efficiency is everything." When the process finished, ashes, bone fragments, and charred scraps were shoveled into metal trays. Sconce didn't match them to any specific name. He didn't care. Families were handed whatever was convenient. A handful of remains from this tray, a scoop from that one. Sometimes the urns contained less than ashes. Sometimes they held nothing at all, and no one suspected. Not yet. Out front, a funeral director offered tissues to a sobbing widow. Behind him, a technician used a hammer to break gold fillings out of a corpse's mouth. The sound echoed through the crematorium like gunshots. But the families never heard, because the walls were thick, and the dead couldn't speak. It began with a question, a simple grieving voice on the other end of a phone line. "Why do the ashes weigh less than they did for my husband?" The woman, elderly, alone, had received her mother's remains 2 weeks after the cremation. The urn was light, suspiciously so. She had lost a husband 5 years earlier and remembered the weight of his ashes. This felt wrong. The receptionist at Lamb Funeral Home reassured her. Standard procedure. Cremains can vary, nothing to worry about. But that call wasn't the first, or the last. Within months, other families began noticing inconsistencies, ashes with bone fragments that didn't belong to the elderly, discoloration that suggested something other than human remains, and in one case, a wedding ring handed back that didn't match the one buried with the body. Whispers started to spread, privately at first, between widows at church luncheons or cousins comparing urns, then louder. A complaint was filed with the California Cemetery Board. It didn't go far. Paperwork showed everything in order. Lamb Funeral Home had an impeccable reputation, on paper. But behind the paperwork, David Sconce's operation was growing darker by the day. His cremation business had scaled beyond Pasadena. He was now contracted by other funeral homes, sometimes handling as many as 16 bodies in a single day, far above the legal capacity of the equipment. His solution? Stack them deeper, burn them faster, crack the skulls to vent gases and speed up the incineration. Every step removed dignity, Every shortcut increased profit. Sconce wasn't alone. Employees participated. A few tried to speak up, but those who did were fired, silenced, or threatened. One whistleblower later told investigators, "You didn't just see bodies being cremated. You saw them being broken, bent, stripped, treated like garbage. We weren't working for a mortician. We were working for a monster." Still, no one outside the walls could prove anything. Not yet. But the smoke rising above Lamb Funeral Home was starting to stink of more than ash. His name was Tim, an embalming assistant barely in his 20s. He started at Lamb Funeral Home thinking he'd entered a noble profession. His first few weeks were routine: flower arrangements, obituary prep, body transport. But it wasn't long before he was summoned behind the steel door into the furnace room. That's where he saw it. 3 bodies on a stretcher, arms dangling over the edges like discarded mannequins. David Sconce stood nearby, laughing to himself, chewing gum while adjusting the temperature on the incinerator. He turned to Tim and said, "Stack 'em tighter. We're behind schedule." Tim hesitated. "Sir, these are supposed to be individual cremations." Sconce looked at him, calm, unfazed. "They're dead, kid. They don't care. And the families, they can't tell the difference. You want to keep your job?" Tim obeyed, but the horror didn't stop there. He witnessed corpses stripped of jewelry before incineration, teeth pulled with pliers, broken bones forced into submission to fit more into the furnace at once. The sound of cracking hips and ribs haunted his dreams. The smell, acrid, chemical, metallic, clung to his skin even after long showers. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Funeral homes were a business. Maybe all places did this. Maybe he was too sensitive. But then came the infant, a baby only a few months old, delivered for cremation. Sconce didn't even blink. He tossed the child's body on top of 2 others already in the furnace, slammed the door, and turned the heat to maximum. When Tim protested, Sconce sneered. "Same weight as a sack of potatoes. Same fire." Tim vomited in the hallway. That night he went home and started typing. A letter, a report, a warning. It reached a local journalist, an investigative bulldog named Maria Holt, who had a reputation for exposing corruption in the most respected places. She read it once, then again. The next morning, she drove straight to Lamb Funeral Home. She knocked politely, smiled, and asked for an interview. David Sconce declined. He always hated reporters. But by then, it was too late. The door had cracked open. The first beam of sunlight had hit the rot inside. And soon, the cameras would follow. Maria Holt wasn't the type to flinch. She'd covered City Hall corruption, crooked cops, even a scandal involving a church-run orphanage. But something about Tim's letter disturbed her more than anything she'd read before. It was too specific, too visceral. She couldn't shake the image of the infant, tossed like waste, incinerated without dignity. She started digging. Her first move, background checks on David Sconce and the Lamb family business. The paper trail went back decades. The Lamb Funeral Home had operated for generations, known for high-end services, polished image, and old money clientele. But when she cross-referenced public death records with cremation logs, inconsistencies began to appear. Names were missing. Dates didn't align. One log showed 12 cremations performed in a single afternoon on a unit rated for no more than 3 per day. She interviewed former employees. Most declined to speak. Some hung up. One, a former driver, simply said, "If you knew what went on back there, you wouldn't sleep either." But Maria wasn't just looking for scandal. She was hunting proof. Then she found it. A coroner's report from a misfiled autopsy. A family had insisted on an independent evaluation before cremation. The body was diverted before reaching Lamb. In the child's mouth, the coroner noted missing gold crowns, although none had been extracted by a dentist. It was the first real evidence of pre-cremation desecration. She contacted the family, then 2 more, whose loved ones had unusual ashes returned. Then she took it to the authorities. But bureaucracy stalled the process. The Cemetery and Funeral Bureau was slow to act. They cited jurisdiction issues, oversight problems, technicalities. That's when Maria did what Sconce feared most. She went public. Front page Sunday edition, full column. The Furnace of Deceit. What's really happening at Lamb Funeral Home? She published quotes from Tim's letter. Photos of the pristine facade of Lamb Funeral Home next to the building's rear incinerator chimney, belching black smoke. She quoted anonymous employees. She named Sconce. By Monday morning, her office phone was ringing non-stop. Some calls were furious, some were frantic, and some were terrified. Because more families were stepping forward. And what they shared made Maria's article look tame. It happened on a Tuesday morning. At precisely 8 a.m., unmarked vehicles pulled into the parking lot of Lamb Funeral Home. Investigators from the California Cemetery and Funeral Bureau, accompanied by Pasadena police and an environmental safety team, stepped out in silence. Inside, the receptionist barely had time to look up before a badge was flashed. "This is a formal inspection. We need full access to the cremation facility." David Sconce wasn't present. He was off-site at another facility, one of several crematories he'd quietly acquired under different names. But 2 of his employees were there, wide-eyed, tight-lipped. The steel door to the private area creaked open. Investigators stepped inside. The stench hit them first, stronger than it should have been. The furnace was off, but the air was thick with scorched fat and chemicals. Then they found it. A large metal bin, partially filled with bone fragments, charred human remains, and, disturbingly, non-organic debris, melted jewelry, false teeth, even a surgical screw. There were no identifying tags. Nearby, they discovered a stack of urns already filled, labeled with names not matching the cremation log. A family expecting cremation on Friday had ashes dated from Wednesday. It got worse. In a utility closet, behind a shelf of cleaning products, they discovered a black ledger, handwritten by Sconce. Inside, notes about batch burns, mentions of max loads, and coded phrases like GSX-3, later decoded as gold salvage, triple pull. There were dollar amounts next to names: $145, $280, $940. A silent economy of death. Outside, one officer radioed dispatch. "We'll need hazmat and forensic backup. This is bigger than just cremation fraud." By noon, the raid made the news. Families gathered outside, sobbing, shouting, demanding answers. Inside, the truth was undeniable. The pristine walls had hidden a conveyor belt of desecration, and the man behind it all wasn't done yet. The human mouth is a vault. In life, it carries truth. In death, it carries gold, crowns, fillings, bridges, dental work worth hundreds, sometimes thousands, if harvested properly. David Sconce knew that, and he built an entire side business around it. He called it recovery. When bodies arrived for cremation, he would examine the mouths first. If the teeth were intact, he'd instruct staff to break the jaws with pliers or hammers. Sometimes he'd do it himself. One sharp crack, then a grim smile as he dropped a gold crown into a collection tray. One employee remembered a jar labeled Ash Reclaim. Inside, dozens of teeth, some still burned black at the root. The gold was melted down and sold to local refiners. He never used his real name. Transactions were made in cash, no records kept. It was clean money, untraceable. Eventually, he bragged about it, at bars, in parking lots. Once, during a dinner with colleagues, he toasted, "Here's to dead men's mouths and living wallets." He was making thousands each month on gold alone. The authorities found melted down residue at one of his off-site facilities, hidden behind false panels in the cremation chamber. There were even notes referencing partials missed, fragments left behind after incomplete burns. Every ounce stolen from someone's mother, grandfather, child. Not just desecration, defilement. He didn't just burn the dead, he robbed them. And when confronted, he felt no shame. "They don't need it anymore," he said in an interview years later. "So why let it go to waste?" The Lamb Funeral Home was once a beacon of dignity in Pasadena. Founded in 1929 by Charles F. Lamb, it stood as a testament to compassionate care for the deceased. Charles's son, Lawrence, continued the tradition, becoming a respected figure in the community. But by the 1980s, the legacy took a dark turn. David Sconce, the great-grandson of Charles, took over operations with a vision not of service, but of profit. Under his leadership, the funeral home transformed into a hub of unethical practices. David's parents, Jerry and Lori Ann Sconce, were not merely bystanders. Jerry, a former football coach, and Lori Ann, a church organist, were deeply involved. They supported David's ventures, including the establishment of Coastal International Eye and Tissue Bank, which facilitated the unauthorized harvesting and sale of organs. The family's reputation shielded them for a time. Their standing in the community made it difficult for outsiders to believe the horrors occurring behind closed doors. But as the truth emerged, the facade crumbled, revealing a legacy tarnished by greed and desecration. The public outcry was deafening. With evidence in hand, ashes mixed from multiple bodies, gold harvested and sold, unlicensed cremations, and bodies desecrated, law enforcement moved fast. David Sconce was arrested in 1988. But the charges were unlike any seen in California funeral history. Multiple counts of felony mutilation of corpses, illegal operation of crematories, false records, fraud, theft, and looming behind it all, the knowledge that over 200 bodies may have been improperly handled under his watch. His parents, Jerry and Lori Ann, were also implicated. They faced charges related to the unauthorized removal and trafficking of body parts through their tissue bank. At one point, it was revealed that organs and eyes were being harvested without consent, some from patients still declared alive at the time of extraction. In court, the families of the deceased wept. One woman clutched the empty urn she'd received and screamed at Sconce from the gallery, "That's not my mother in there, that's no one." Sconce stood expressionless. No apology, no remorse. In a deal to avoid a long trial, he pled guilty to multiple counts of mutilating human remains, running unlicensed crematories, grand theft, and fraud. He received 5 years in state prison and served only 2.5. Outrage followed. Journalists, families, and lawmakers demanded justice. How could a man who desecrated the dead walk free so quickly? The legal system responded, but slowly. In 2013, years after his initial release, Sconce was sentenced again, 25 years to life, for violating parole and continuing unlicensed operations in defiance of court orders. He was finally incarcerated for good. But even behind bars, he never admitted wrongdoing. To the end, he insisted, it was just business. David Sconce had been stopped, but the damage he caused couldn't be buried. In the months following his conviction, investigators combed through the funeral industry in California, and what they found was chilling. Lax inspections, outdated regulations, glaring loopholes. Some crematories had never been visited by state officials. Others operated without updated licenses. Paper logs were often falsified, and there was no legal requirement for the ashes returned to a family to match the body cremated. What Sconce had done wasn't just monstrous, it was shockingly easy. Families across the state began questioning the integrity of their own funeral homes. Legislators in Sacramento were bombarded with calls. Advocacy groups demanded reforms. Within a year, California passed a sweeping reform package. Mandatory audits of cremation facilities, state-monitored ID tagging systems for all remains, harsh penalties for tampering with bodies or misrepresenting ashes, a complete ban on unlicensed tissue harvesting. But it wasn't just a California problem. National news networks picked up the story. The New York Times ran the headline, "How many more sconces are out there?" Funeral directors across the country faced suspicion. A quiet profession, once regarded with solemn trust, was now under a microscope, and in homes across America, people looked at the urns on their shelves and whispered, "Is this really them?" Time has passed. The Lamb Funeral Home is no longer in operation. Its windows are boarded. The rose bushes are dead. Weeds have overtaken the once pristine lawn. But for the families it betrayed, the scars never closed. Some never learned what happened to their loved ones' remains. The ashes they received, if they received anything at all, became a grim question mark, a void in a box. One woman kept her urn in a closet, unable to display it. Another buried hers with a new name etched on the stone, unknown but loved. Journalists moved on. The headlines faded. But in quiet moments, in basements, in attics, in the corners of bookshelves, those ashes still sit, silent, heavy, ambiguous, each one a symbol of betrayal. David Sconce was just one man, but his crimes forced the world to confront a terrifying truth, that even in death we are not always safe, that the systems meant to honor our passing can be corrupted, that greed can scorch the sanctity of mourning, and that fire, when misused, erases not just the body, but the dignity, the legacy, the meaning. The Lamb scandal wasn't just about what was done, it was about what was allowed. And while Sconce is no longer a free man, the damage remains. In the quiet houses of the grieving, in the distrust of a once respected profession, in the weight of an urn that might be full of lies, because the dead can't scream. But sometimes, their ashes still speak. The dead deserve peace, but some are handled by hands that bring only profit and pain. Next time, we uncover the hospital room where the machines kept running, long after the patient stopped breathing.